You're being persuaded right now. Not by me, not by this video, but by forces so subtle, so embedded in your daily interactions, that you mistake their influence for your own thoughts. You believe you're making independent choices, forming your own opinions, deciding your own path. But Machiavelli would laugh at that delusion. Because every conversation you have, every piece of content you consume, every social interaction you navigate is a battlefield where your mind is the prize. Most people never realize they're losing this war. They walk through life as willing participants in their own manipulation, nodding along to ideas that were planted, not grown. They defend positions they never chose, chase goals that were suggested, and feel emotions that were engineered. And the worst part? They're grateful for it. They thank the very people who've rewired their thinking, who've turned their decision-making process into a predictable algorithm. But here's what the manipulators don't want you to know. Every persuasion technique, every psychological trick, every subtle influence campaign has a weakness, a crack in the armor, a way to not just resist, but to turn the tables entirely. Because once you understand how the game is played, you stop being a piece on the board. You become the player moving the pieces. This isn't about becoming paranoid or suspicious of everyone around you. This is about developing what Machiavelli called the fox's cunning. The ability to see traps before you step into them. To recognize when someone is playing chess while pretending to have a casual conversation. To spot the difference between genuine influence and calculated manipulation. The first thing you need to understand is this. Persuasion isn't about logic. It never was. It's about emotion wrapped in the illusion of logic. Every master manipulator knows that people make decisions with their feelings and then create rational explanations afterward. They'll spend hours crafting logical arguments, not because logic persuades, but because logic provides cover for the emotional decisions they've already triggered. Think about the last time someone changed your mind about something important. Did they present you with a series of facts that forced you to recalculate your position? Or did they make you feel something first? Doubt, excitement, fear, hope, and then give you reasons to justify that feeling? The answer reveals the true nature of persuasion. It's emotional manipulation disguised as intellectual discourse. This is why most people fail to resist influence. They prepare for logical arguments when they should be guarding their emotional responses. They fact-check claims when they should be examining how those claims make them feel. They debate the content when they should be analyzing the delivery. It's like wearing armor on your chest while leaving your back exposed. Machiavelli understood this centuries before modern psychology confirmed it. He knew that the prince who could control emotions could control kingdoms. Not through force, but through the subtle art of making people want to be controlled. Making them believe that submission was their own idea, that obedience was wisdom, that following was actually leading. But every system of control contains the seeds of its own destruction. Every manipulation technique reveals the manipulator's strategy if you know how to read the signs. And once you can read those signs, once you can see the invisible strings, you can cut them. Not just for yourself, but for anyone else caught in the web. The key is understanding that persuasion operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the surface level, what's being said explicitly. There's the emotional level, what feelings are being triggered. There's the social level, what group dynamics are being leveraged. And there's the temporal level, how time pressure and pacing are being used to bypass critical thinking. Most people only defend against the surface level. They fact-check the claims, they question the evidence, they look for logical fallacies. But while they're busy analyzing the content, the real attack is happening on the other three levels. Their emotions are being hijacked, their social instincts are being weaponized, and their decision-making timeline is being compressed. This is where Machiavellian logic becomes your shield. Not the popular misconception of Machiavellianism as ruthless ambition, but the true essence of his teachings. the cold, analytical observation of human nature, the refusal to be swayed by what people say they're doing when you can see what they're actually doing, the discipline to separate intention from action, promise from performance, appearance from reality. When someone is trying to persuade you, they're not just presenting information. They're managing your attention, directing your focus, controlling the frame of reference. They decide what questions you ask, what alternatives you consider, what timeline you operate under. They become the narrator of your decision-making process, and most people never realize they've handed over that power. But once you recognize this dynamic, once you see persuasion as a form of mental architecture where someone else is designing the building you think in, you can start to reclaim control. You can step back from the blueprint they've drawn and ask the questions they hoped you wouldn't ask. Why now? Why this? Why me? Why not the alternative they didn't mention? The most dangerous persuaders aren't the obvious ones. They're not the aggressive salespeople or the bombastic politicians. They're the ones who make you feel like you're discovering their ideas on your own, who guide you to conclusions while making it seem like independent thinking, who use your own values and beliefs as weapons against your judgment. These are the ones Machiavelli would have called the most skilled. They don't attack your defenses directly. They convince you to lower them voluntarily. They don't force their ideas on you. They create conditions where you'll arrive at their preferred conclusions naturally. They don't argue with your objections. They redirect them into supporting their position. This level of sophistication requires a different kind of defense, not just critical thinking, but what we might call metacritical thinking. The ability to think about your own thinking, to observe your own mental processes, to notice when your emotions are being engaged, when your social instincts are being triggered, when your decision-making is being rushed. It means developing what Machiavelli called the lion's strength, the courage to say no even when saying yes feels easier, safer, more socially acceptable, the willingness to be seen as difficult, unreasonable, or uncooperative rather than be led somewhere you didn't choose to go. But here's where most people make a crucial mistake. They think resistance means isolation. They believe that protecting themselves from influence means cutting themselves off from all input, all advice, all social connection. This isn't strength, it's paranoia. And paranoia is just another form of mental prison, one where you're both the guard and the prisoner. True freedom from manipulation isn't about rejecting all influence. It's about choosing which influences to accept and which to reject based on your own criteria, not theirs. It's about maintaining the ability to change your mind without losing the discipline to make that change deliberately, consciously, for reasons you understand and endorse. This requires what Machiavelli would recognize as the ultimate political skill: the ability to navigate power dynamics without being consumed by them, to understand the game without losing yourself in it, to protect your autonomy while remaining engaged with the world around you. The manipulators count on your ignorance of their methods. They rely on your assumption that persuasion is a fair fight between competing ideas. They need you to believe that influence is always obvious, always direct, always something you'd notice if it were happening to you. But influence is like water. It finds the path of least resistance. It flows around your conscious defenses and pools in the spaces you're not watching. It shapes the landscape of your thinking so gradually that you mistake the new terrain for the natural order of things. The first defense against this invisible erosion is awareness of the terrain itself. Most people think they're standing on solid ground when they're actually floating on a raft that someone else is steering. They feel the movement, but attribute it to natural currents rather than deliberate navigation. This is the fundamental error that makes manipulation possible. The assumption that your mental environment is neutral, that your thoughts arise in a vacuum, that your decisions emerge from pure personal reflection. Machiavelli would tell you to abandon this comforting fiction immediately. Your mental environment is never neutral. It's always being shaped by someone, and if you're not shaping it yourself, then someone else is doing it for you. The question isn't whether you're being influenced. The question is whether you're aware of who's doing the influencing and why. This awareness begins with recognizing the architecture of persuasion itself. Every influence attempt follows a predictable structure, regardless of its content or complexity. First, there's the approach. The way the influencer gains access to your attention and establishes their right to be heard. Second, there's the frame, the context they create for evaluating their message. Third, there's the hook, the emotional trigger that makes you care about their conclusion. Fourth, there's the bridge, the logical pathway they construct between your current position and their desired outcome. Finally, there's the close, the moment when they ask for commitment or action. Understanding this structure is like having a map of enemy territory. You can see the landmarks before you reach them. You can anticipate the next move before it's made. You can prepare your response before you're pressured to give one. Most importantly, you can choose to take a different route entirely, but recognizing the structure is only half the battle. The other half is understanding your own vulnerabilities. Every person has psychological triggers that bypass rational analysis, points of pride that can be leveraged, fears that can be exploited, desires that can be redirected, social needs that can be weaponized. The skilled persuader studies these vulnerabilities like a general studies enemy fortifications. They probe for weak points, test responses, calibrate their approach based on what generates the strongest reaction. The Machiavellian defense against this reconnaissance is deliberate opacity. Not dishonesty, but strategic ambiguity about what motivates you, what threatens you, what excites you. You reveal these things selectively on your own terms when it serves your purposes. You don't hand over the emotional keys to your decision-making process just because someone asks nicely or creates artificial intimacy. This means developing what interrogators would recognize as operational security for your mind. You compartmentalize information about your vulnerabilities. You don't discuss your fears with people who might use them against you. You don't reveal your aspirations to those who might dangle false promises. You don't expose your insecurities to anyone who might exploit them for leverage. This isn't about becoming cold or calculating. It's about recognizing that information about your inner world is valuable, and valuable things shouldn't be given away carelessly. Every time you share what really matters to you with someone whose agenda you don't fully understand, you're handing them ammunition that could be used against your own interests. The next layer of defense involves understanding the timing dynamics of persuasion. Manipulators don't just control what you think about. They control when you think about it. They create urgency where none exists. They manufacture deadlines that serve their purposes, not yours. They compress your decision-making timeline until careful analysis becomes impossible and emotional reaction becomes inevitable. Time pressure is the enemy of good judgment. When you're rushed, you rely on mental shortcuts that can be predicted and exploited. You default to social proof instead of independent analysis. You choose familiar options over optimal ones. You prioritize immediate comfort over long-term benefit. You say yes to avoid the temporary discomfort of saying no. The Machiavellian response to artificial urgency is deliberate delay. You slow down when they want you to speed up. You expand your timeline when they want to compress it. You introduce waiting periods when they demand immediate decisions. You create space for reflection when they're pushing for reaction. This requires the psychological strength to tolerate their discomfort with your pace. They'll escalate the pressure. They'll question your competence or commitment. They'll suggest that opportunities are slipping away or that others are moving faster. They'll make you feel like your caution is actually foolishness, like your deliberation is actually procrastination. But time is the ally of clear thinking and the enemy of manipulation. The longer you take to decide, the more opportunity you have to see through emotional appeals to logical flaws. The more space you create between stimulus and response, the more control you maintain over your own choices. The more you resist their timeline, the more you enforce your own sovereignty over your decision-making process. This temporal resistance becomes even more powerful when combined with what Machiavelli would call strategic questioning. Instead of accepting the questions they want you to ask, you ask the questions they hope you won't ask. Instead of operating within their framework, you examine the framework itself. Instead of debating their premises, you challenge their right to set the terms of the debate. Most persuasion attempts rely on controlling the scope of consideration. They want you to choose between options A and B while ignoring option C. They want you to focus on benefits while overlooking costs. They want you to consider immediate consequences while dismissing long-term implications. They want you to think about what you'll gain while forgetting what you'll lose. The antidote to this controlled consideration is systematic expansion of scope. You ask about alternatives they didn't mention. You inquire about costs they didn't calculate. You explore consequences they didn't consider. You examine assumptions they didn't acknowledge. You force the discussion beyond the boundaries they've established. This expansion often reveals the weakness in their position. If their proposal was truly optimal, they wouldn't need to restrict your consideration to carefully selected options. If their timeline was genuinely necessary, they wouldn't resist your questions about its origins. If their urgency was real, they wouldn't deflect when you ask for verification. But perhaps the most sophisticated defense against manipulation involves understanding the social and cultural currents that carry persuasive messages. Ideas don't spread in isolation. They travel on networks of trust, authority, and social proof. They gain momentum through repetition and reinforcement. They become normalized through widespread acceptance. The manipulator who understands these currents doesn't just present their message. They embed it in trusted networks. They have it delivered by respected authorities. They surround it with social proof until disagreement feels like social deviance. They make their position seem like the natural consensus of reasonable people. This is where most resistance fails. People try to argue against ideas that have been socially normalized without recognizing that they're not just fighting logic, they're fighting social gravity. They're positioning themselves against not just an argument, but an entire ecosystem of reinforcement. The Machiavellian approach to this challenge is different. Instead of fighting the current directly, you analyze its source and direction. You ask who benefits from this particular idea becoming widespread. You examine what interests are served by this consensus. You identify the original architects behind what appears to be organic social movement. When you trace influence back to its source, you often discover that widespread beliefs didn't emerge naturally from collective wisdom. They were seeded deliberately by those who profit from their acceptance. The idea that you need their product, their service, their approval, their validation didn't arise spontaneously from mass enlightenment. It was cultivated through systematic campaign of suggestion and reinforcement. Once you see the machinery behind the message, once you recognize the deliberate construction of what feels like natural consensus, you can step outside the current entirely. You can observe the flow without being carried by it. You can watch others being swept along while maintaining your own position on solid ground. But the ultimate defense against persuasion isn't just intellectual, it's existential. It requires developing such a clear sense of your own values, priorities, and objectives that external attempts to redirect them become immediately obvious. When you know precisely what you want and why you want it, when your goals emerge from deep personal reflection rather than social suggestion, manipulation attempts feel like interference rather than guidance. This clarity acts like an immune system for your decision-making process. Just as a healthy body recognizes and rejects foreign substances, a healthy mind recognizes and rejects foreign agendas. You don't have to analyze every influence attempt in detail because your internal compass immediately alerts you when someone is trying to redirect your trajectory. This internal navigation system isn't built overnight. It requires regular examination of your own motivations. It demands honest assessment of whether your desires are truly yours or borrowed from others. It means questioning not just what you want, but why you want it, where that wanting originated, and who benefits from your pursuit. The person who has done this internal work becomes nearly impossible to manipulate because they've eliminated the entry points that manipulation requires. They can't be redirected because they have a clear destination. They can't be rushed because they operate on their own timeline. They can't be shamed into compliance because they've examined and accepted their own choices. This is the ultimate application of Machiavellian logic to the problem of persuasion. Not the cynical manipulation of others, but the sophisticated protection of yourself. The development of such clear internal authority that external attempts at control become powerless. When you reach this level of psychological sovereignty, something remarkable happens. You stop being a target for manipulation, not because you've built impenetrable defenses, but because you've eliminated the vulnerability that made you a target in the first place. You become uninteresting to manipulators because there's nothing for them to exploit. The person who cannot be persuaded against their will, who cannot be rushed into poor decisions, who cannot be shamed into compliance, who cannot be redirected from their chosen path. This person has achieved something rare in our age of constant influence. They have maintained their autonomy in a world designed to eliminate it. This is your inheritance from Machiavelli's true teaching. Not the popular caricature of ruthless ambition, but the deeper wisdom of clear-eyed self-protection. The ability to navigate a world full of competing agendas while maintaining your own. The strength to remain yourself in the face of constant pressure to become someone else's version of you. The spell of persuasion breaks the moment you realize you were never required to remain under it. You always had the power to step outside the circle, to question the premises, to reject the timeline, to choose your own direction. The only thing that kept you bound was the belief that you had no choice. But you do have a choice. You've always had a choice, and now you know how to use it.